Hello, this is Jim Lloyd with Folk on 2. Tonight I'll be talking to one of the most influential figures of the folk revival, Martin Carthy. Over the past 20 years, Martin Carthy has had a very successful partnership with Dave Swarbrick. He was a founder member of Steel Eye Span and made a significant contribution to the Albion Band and Brass Monkey. He's a member of the Watersons. In the theatre, he's appeared with both the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre. But his most important contribution to the folk movement is as a solo performer.
Oh, there was a woman and she lived on her own. She slaved on her own and she skivied on her own. She 2 little girls and 2 little boys, and she lived all alone with her husband. For her husband, he was a hunk of a man, a chunk of a man, and a drunk of a man. He was a hunk of a drunk and skunk of a man, such a bruising husband. For he would come out drunk each night. He thrashed her black and he thrashed her white. He thrashed her to within an inch of her life. Then he slept like a long did her husband. One night she gathered her tears all round her shame. She thought of the bruising and cried with the pain. Oh, you'll not do that ever again. I won't live with a drunken husband. But as he lay and snored in bed, a strange old thought came into her head. She went for the needle, went for the thread, and went straight into her sleeping husband. And she started to stitch with a girlish thrill, with a woman's heart and a seamstress skill. She bibbed and tucked with an iron will, all around her sleeping husband. On the top sheet, the bottom sheet too, the blanket stitched to the mattress through. She stitched and stitched for the whole night through, and then she waited the dawn and her husband. And when her husband awoke with a pain in his head, he found that he could not move in bed. Sweet Christ, I've lost the use of my legs. But this wife just smiled at her husband, for in her hand she held the frying pan. With a flutter in her heart, she'd given him a lamb. He could not move, but he cried, God damn, don't you swear, she cries to her husband. And then she thrashed him black, she thrashed him blue, with the frying pan and the colander too. With the rolling pin, just a stroke or two, such a battered and bleeding husband. And she says, if you ever come home drunk anymore, I'll stitch you in and I'll thrash you more. Then I'll pack my bag and I'll be out the door. I'll not live with a drunken husband. Oh, isn't it true what small can do with a thread and a thought and a stitch or two? He's wiped his slate and his bruising's through. It's goodbye to a drunken husband.
A Stitch in Time from Martin Carthy's current album, Rite of Passage. Martin, that's more or less where you are now musically. Where did you begin?
My parents were people who sort of liked music, but they tended to stick to classical music, or they would go for the odd things like Phil Harris and the Rich Maharaja of Mogador and Frank Crummett and Leslie Saroni. They had their selection of music wasn't what you would call wide, but it was probably 2 extremes. And not much in the middle. They weren't fond of light opera. They were fond of opera. They weren't fond of operetta, if you like. They didn't like things like Mantovani. They liked the real thing. They wanted to have a full orchestra conducted by Toscanini. You know.
Were they musical people themselves? Did you have any musicians in your family?
My aunt is a piano player. She'd started learning fairly early on, and she had to give it up. My parents. My father comes from the East End of London, and he won a scholarship to the grammar school across the bridge across Tower Bridge, St Olave's Grammar School. And in order for him to go to school, she had to go out to work. I mean, that was the way of it, and she just accepted that. But she played then, and she plays now. She's a very good piano player too.
But did you actually hear much of her playing in your own home, or was most of your influence from records, radio?
We would hear, Trudy would come in, and when Christmas and birthdays, she would come in and she'd play a bit when she got a couple inside her. And it was always a little bit shocking, because she played she played popular tunes of the time, either from memory or from music. And she is a really energetic piano player. She didn't play the classics, not when we were all around anyway. I presume she can. I've never heard her play classics. Her favourite piano player was Charlie Kunz, and this was the sort of beginning of any. Well, later on, I began to sort of go for what my parents considered the more disreputable side of music, and this was the first inkling, if you like. And later on, when I was like 14 or something, and 15 maybe, and I discovered Lonnie Donegan and heard about jazz clubs, I used to go to Cy Laurie's jazz club on a Sunday afternoon. I wasn't allowed to go in the evening because there were reefers there. At least that's what the papers said.
Oh, yes, rather. Well, let's not get on to the Lonnie Donegan era yet. Let's start with one of your earlier musical memories.
Well, when I was about 6, I think, I could have been 7, but I think it was 59 Aberdare Gardens, which would be 6 or 7. There was a record in the hit parade called The Rich Maharaja of Mogadore, and we all used to wait for it to come on Housewives' Choice or on Children's Choice, whichever it was. Probably both, actually.
Monroe back in 1948. How old were you in 1948?
6 or 7.
Yeah. Did you have a family record collection at that time?
Oh, yes. I mean, my other very, very strong memory was the very first time my parents put on the Revolutionary Study by Chopin, played by Cortot. They wanted Schnabel, but they said Cortot will do. And they put this on, and I ran away and hid. And I cried and I cried and I cried, and I wouldn't stop until they took the record up. And every time they put it on, I'd be somewhere around and I'd start crying and insist that they took it off, because it always made me cry.
Well, it used to make you feel quite weepy as a child. How do you feel about that now?
Still does. Does the same effect. I think it's wonderful.
What about your own musical development? Did you do music at school, Martin?
I did music, yes. I say sometimes I sort of did the standard music lessons at school, but we did have a pretty extraordinary music master at the school I went to, whose name was Gerald Wheeler, and he was a very young man. And he was absolutely full of it. He was absolutely full of music and bursting at the seams with it and incredibly excited about it. And he was one of those people who was actually able to communicate his excitement. He had a class full of working class kids.
Whereabouts was this, in London?
I actually went to the same school as my father. I went to St Olave's Grammar School down at the end of Tooley Street on the corner of Tower Bridge Road. It's not there anymore. They moved it out of London. It's somewhere down in Kent now. And it's just called St Olave's School. The headmaster was one of those people who didn't want to become comprehensive. So he and a band of others split from London. But this particular music teacher was an extraordinary man, and he'd have a class full of working class kids, and they'd be all ready to giggle, and by the end of it, they weren't laughing; they were really taking part. He got our school choir and he drilled it into the most phenomenal shape. It was a really fabulous choir. The school orchestra wasn't so hot, but
were you in the orchestra?
No, I wasn't in the orchestra. He was one of those. He actually introduced brass into the school orchestra, and I was given a trombone to learn. And I was really excited about it for all of 3 weeks, and then I got fed up with it.
You were a chorister as well, weren't you?
I was a chorister, and that was because of him. When I was 12, I joined the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy Choir, and our school used to supply the choristers for the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy and half the choristers for Southwark Cathedral. And he said that, did I fancy being a chorister? Because there was a place available at the Savoy Chapel. And I said, yes. So I went along on the Sunday at 10 o'clock for the rehearsal. And the bloke the master of the music was a fella called Dr. Derry, Dr. Henry Bromley Derry. And he just shoved a piece of Orlando Gibbons in my hand and said, sing! So I stood there and I sang. He said, all right, put on this cassock, put on this surplice, put on this ruff, out there and do it. So that was my audition. And the choir used to specialise really in Orlando Gibbons, Thomas Weelkes, Thomas Tomkins, Thomas Tallis, with the occasional bit of Vaughan Williams thrown in. No William Byrd. And that was a fabulous education, but always lurking beneath the surface. I mean, I used to go from there, from the choir on Sunday morning. I'd go home on my bike, have my Sunday dinner, and then I'd dive off down. By the time I was 14, I was still in the choir. I used to dive off down to Cy Laurie's Jazz Club for the Sunday afternoon sessions. And then I discovered skiffle. So for a while, I was in one of the school skiffle groups. There were 3 or 4. The best one was run by Bert Lloyd's son, who was called Joe. And he always had... We couldn't understand where Joe got his repertoire from. We kept asking him, where are you getting all your songs? He said, I get them from my dad. Who's your dad? Oh, he's a singer, he would say. And he was very mysterious about it, but he always had this fabulous repertoire. And from there I went... I heard about the Princess Louise, which was one of the places Bert sang in. So I went down to the Princess Louise one night on a Sunday and heard Peggy Seeger and Ralph Rinsler, who's now the boss of the Smithsonian Institute, but in those days he sang and played mandolin, probably guitar and a few other things too, but I saw him as a mandolin player. And I have a memory of Alan Lomax being around, but I think I just wanted him to be there, and my memory has painted him in, you know. But there were all these people singing songs which were, 1 or 2 of them I recognised as being the originals of stuff that was in the hit parade, stuff like Cumberland Gap, stuff like Gambling Man.
Well, let's have something from that time.
Go on. Lost John, Lonnie Donegan. Everybody always plays Rock Island Line, but I really do rather like Lost John.
Lonnie Donegan, one of the unsung heroes of the folk revival. Was he a hero of yours?
Oh yes, great hero. I mean, the first time I heard Rock Island Line, it was just a door opening. He was fabulous. I still think that's a fabulous record. I think Rock Island Line is a fabulous record. I think all those things he made then they really stand up very, very well now.
It really was a turning point, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. I mean, it was so much of... I think one of the reasons why all of us lot of sort of my age, say, we didn't narrow our taste. We were just grateful for anything, because it was a time of austerity, and that was the same with music. And when something like that came along, it was like a beacon. Suddenly the world was flooded with light, and music was something that hit you in the heart and in the stomach, and it was... Oh, it's wonderful. It was a wonderful moment. But I must say that when I heard... We had a wind-up gramophone. All the records I had were 78, so if I wanted to hear any EPs or LPs, whether they be 10-inch or 12-inch, I had to go to my mates' houses. And... one of my mates could have been Lonnie's first 10-inch LP, it could have been his second, I don't know. But he did a recording of Frankie and Johnny, and suddenly there were cracks in the facade. I thought, wait a minute, Lonnie's doing something that I don't like. Because I had a recording of Frankie and Johnny by Frank Crummett, and I really did prefer my rotten old 78 version to his version.
And he'd done her wrong.
The well-worn 78 from the Carthy family collection.
I used to play it on our wind-up gramophone, all the records I had, my Elvis records and my Lonnie Donegan records. And I used to try and play along with them if I could, and sing along with them. I mean, at the same time as buying that, I remember hearing on the radio a recording of a woman called Isabel Bailey singing "Let the Bright Seraphim" and absolutely flipping, and rushing up to the record shop in Swiss Cottage, and I tried to buy it immediately, but they didn't have it. I had to order it. And I used to sing along with this as well. And when I got fed up with singing Isabel Bailey's part, I used to try and sing the trumpet part. But then I was a chorister.
Well, let's have a listen to it, particularly the trumpet part. Let the Bright Seraphim. Well, there we are, Martin. I have a mental picture of you standing there beside your wind-up gramophone in your front room, singing the trumpet part along with Isabel Bailey.
That's right. Well, I had to be careful sometimes because I had to make sure I had my guitar handy, because across the road from our sitting room was on the first floor, and across the road lived Nancy Whiskey. And whenever she walked past, I used to have to be nonchalantly at the window, casually strumming the guitar and looking surprised when she looked in. At the age of 15, strutting around the window with my guitar, thrashing away with my thumb on Worried Man Blues.
Where do you get involved with folk music from there?
Well, I think I got involved because I read of a case in one of the papers that Chas McDevitt had been taken to court successfully by people who said that somebody else had written Freight Train, and that somebody else's name didn't register at the time. But I later found out that it was a woman called Elizabeth Cotton. And in about 1958 or 59, I managed to get hold of a Folkways album, which was called Negro Folk Songs and Tunes, and this Freight Train was on it. And I mean, I didn't even listen to it. I went and got the record, took it home, borrowed a record player, because we still didn't have a proper one, we still had our wind-up, borrowed a record player and played it. And the first track was Wilson Rag, as I remember, and the second track was Freight Train.
Oh, that's Liver Cotton. That was recorded at a New Lost City Ramblers reunion some years after the record you must have had, wasn't it?
The record I had was recorded in the 50s, and I lent it to someone who never returned it. I hope you've enjoyed it all these years. But then I met her and I ate her chicken stew. Ha ha.
Where was that?
That was the very first time I went and did a proper tour in the States. It was in just outside Los Angeles, actually. I walked into the house, exhausted from a plane journey, and walked into Elizabeth Cotton and went, "Oh my God, all my dreams have come true." It was, yes, it was a great moment for me. It took me years to understand why I couldn't play Freight Train like Liber Cotton. And then I discovered that she played guitar. She took a normal right-handed, what I call a normal right-handed guitar, and just turned it over and played it with the top strings nearest her face and the bass strings down below. So her right-hand fingering was weird, but her left-hand fingering was, her left-hand fingering was really, really weird indeed. She could do things that nobody else could do because she was playing upside down. That was a great moment too.
Well, let's go back to your early musical education. Where did it go from there?
Well, at about the same time as getting that particular record, I used to go round to a mate's house, a mate called Mickey Delaney, who had Hot 5 and Hot 7 EPs. And I decided then, and I still think, that if I couldn't play the guitar, the one thing I would really, really love to do would be able to play clarinet like Johnny Dodds.
Louis Armstrong's Hot 7 Weary Blues.
Oh, I will never forget the first time I heard that clarinet solo. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It just comes. I mean, it still does the same thing to me. It still sounds as though it comes completely from another planet. That's wonderful.
Still a long way from what we think of as English traditional or folk music.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, they all have the same drive. I don't see any difference between the drives of any traditional musics from anywhere. Anything that surprises you like that's made up by a human being from nothing is, as far as I'm concerned, is folk music. You know, that's it. Yeah. What you're hearing is folk art there. And again, I tend to telescope sort of 57 to 59 quite radically, and I've no real clue as to the dates of things, but I remember at around about the same time, walking out of Belsize Park Station and meeting Roy Guest in the company of Jeannie Robertson. I'd met Roy 57 or 58 when he'd just come back from Canada, and I used to knock around in a coffee bar called the Witch's Cauldron down in Belsize Lane. Also another place down in Elizabeth Mews at the bottom of Primrose Gardens called the Loft. And I met Roy, and Roy used to play in the Witch's Cauldron. And at some other point he started doing concerts with various people, including Robin Hall. I'd heard Robin Hall talk about Jeannie Robertson, coming up in a minute. And I'd heard one or two records of her that were out on a label called Collector. And I thought, she's got a nice voice, but nothing prepares you for Jeannie. Nothing really prepares you for actually meeting the woman in the flesh. And nothing really prepared me for what I felt when I first heard her sing. But it was the same thing as hearing Johnny Dodds.
Selassie and the lad to a nigger if they were bedden.
There's Jeannie Robertson. She wasn't actually singing in these places you were going to, the coffee bars.
No, they were more formal concerts. They'd be at somewhere like the Purcell Rooms or the Conway Hall or St Pancras Town Hall or maybe even Cecil Sharp House. They were, generally speaking, the places that concerts were put on.
What about yourself? Were you singing by now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd sung... from the moment I heard Rock Island Line and was in one of the skiffle groups at school, I'd started singing, so that in the evenings, eventually it became that I forewent doing my homework, and I would just go out to a coffee bar. The first place I went to was a place called Gleb's in Flask Walk, and I'd go with my guitar and sort of thrash away and sing. Then during the daytime, by this time, I was singing tenor in the school choir, and then on Sundays I was singing soprano in the Savoy Chapel choir. I'd get there at 10 o'clock with no voice, and by the time the service came round at 11:15, I'd got to my range. I could hit all the top G's and top A's, because the man who had taught us all to sing in the beginning, this fellow Dr. Derry, I think taught you in a different way. He taught boys to sing so that if they wanted to, they could go on singing soprano the rest of their lives. It's just a way of producing the voice.
Can you still do it?
I can't do it. No. You've got to practice. I mean, I would have to practice every Sunday. If I missed a Sunday, I was in trouble. I'd have to have a little workout beforehand, get to the practice good and early, have a little workout, and then we'd have a rehearsal, an hour's rehearsal. And by the end of the hour's rehearsal, I was in reasonable condition. I think I left that choir just before my 17th birthday because I thought I thought I was being very unmasculine, very unmacho. I mean, macho wasn't a word you used then, but I didn't think it was right that a 17-year-old should still be singing soprano. I should be singing bass, And apart from anything, by this time I was very confused about singing, because I was hearing all this wonderful music from people like Elizabeth Cotton and Big Bill Broomsey, and Big Bill Broomsey was the first person I ever heard play guitar excitingly and properly. It wasn't just thrashing away. He played. He played with his fingers, which was something, at that time, to play with your fingers was like a far-off dream,
Did you ever see Big Bill Broomsey, Martin?
No, I never did.
Why I asked, at that time there seemed to be so many Americans coming over, didn't there? You see them all sorts of places.
I don't know why I didn't go. I mean, I'd heard the music, I knew he was around, but I never followed it up. I loved his guitar playing. But for some reason I didn't go. I mean, I took time out to go and see Ravi Shankar the very first time he came to England. And he played at the Festival Hall. And I and about 30 Indian people were sat in the Royal Festival Hall on one Sunday afternoon. Again, after I went straight from the Savoy Chapel.
There was a lot going on, wasn't there, with the coffee bars and the beginnings of the folk clubs there?
It was coming out of austerity, and there was a lot of excitement around. There was a lot in the air. I mean, I used to play in this place, the Witch's Cauldron, and my hero at the time was Robin Hall, and I remember hearing him sing a song called we called it Down in the Mines. It's a Mel Travis song, The Lure of the Mines, which again, I think your instincts at that time are pretty damn good, because I still think that is a fabulous song. There was a time when I got a bit superior about it, but I heard it the other day, and it really is a cracking song. Yeah. And Robin used to sing it beautifully. And he used to talk about Jeannie Robertson, and he also used to talk about this place called the Troubadour. Oh, you really ought to go down the Troubadour. It's a Saturday night. It's late, and I was still a bit young, and I didn't have any money, and I could have got down to the Troubadour, but there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell that I would ever be able to get home because it finished at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you had to get a taxi, and that was 10 bob. You know, if you could get a taxi driver who wouldn't say, "Oh, it's more than 6 miles, you've got to pay double." And the idea of paying 10 bob, I didn't have 10 bob. One night, I did actually go down to the Troubadour, and I walked in the door, and as I walked in the door, I heard this really weird sound, and I walked in and looked, and there was this man sitting down playing the bagpipes. And I've just never seen anything like this at all. And it was Seamus Ennis, and I don't know what tune he was playing, but I sat and I watched him all night, and he played the pipes, he played the whistle, and he sang. And there again, all my choral training, all my choristers training, was telling me that what he was singing was the way he was singing was all wrong. But I went home and I knew, he told me a whole lot of stories, all of which I remembered. And having heard the Irish pipes for the first time, which just blew me clean out of my socks.
The Bucks of Oranmore, played by Seamus Ennis, who you first heard at the Troubadour Club in London's Earl's Court Road.
Right.
It really was unique, wasn't it, the Troubadour?
Well, it was one of the very few late-night places around that people like me could go and play at. And the thing about late-night places was that musicians used to go and just be there after their gigs. And a lot of the people who used to go down to the Troubadour and be there after their gigs were jazzers. And that's where I first ran up against Diz Disley, who was there. You could pretty well guarantee that Diz would show up. And he would either show up on his own or he'd show up with one or two of his mates. I remember there was a guy called Paul Simpson who played just about every kind of saxophone that existed. Amazing player. Fiddle player Johnny Van Derrick, I think he came down with Diz a couple of times. But because of that, I became more interested in jazz. Up until then, I'd been interested in sort of what we called at the time traditional jazz.
I think jazz and folk were much closer together, the musicians then, weren't
Yeah,
they?
of course, because the folk scene had, as far as I was concerned, the folk scene had grown out of the skiffle boom, and the skiffle boom was an adjunct of the jazz scene, wasn't it? So I think it was fairly natural that the two would maintain links for some time afterwards. It would have been nice if they'd maintained links all the time, but of course they haven't, with one or two exceptions. There's people like Danny Thompson who still poke their nose around the door, thank goodness. But in those days, it was through meeting people like Diz that I became interested in other kinds of guitar playing. And I remember people talking about Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian.
ML special from Charlie Christian with the Benny Goodman Sextet. Now the time is 8 o'clock.
Radio 2.
And in Folk on 2 tonight, Martin Carthy is talking about his musical influences. And after Charlie Christian, what came next, Martin?
Well, I joined a group called the Timside Four, which was Marion Gray, Red Sullivan and Pete Maynard. Originally, Long John Baldry had been the fourth member. He was replaced on a temporary basis by Wally Whiten, and when Wally said he really couldn't go on replacing on a temporary basis, I was asked to join. The breadth of repertoire of the Timside Four was enormous. We do quite a lot of English traditional stuff. We do a lot of American stuff, a lot of stuff from various of the West Indies, and bits of jazz and blues and a lot of gospel, because Marion used to love singing gospel and used to do it very well too. And one day she came into rehearsal with a record called Forbidden Fruit by a woman called Nina Simone, who I'd never heard of at the time. And she said, "This is the business." And she put on the first track, and it was just wonderful. It was an Oscar Brown Jr. song called Rags and Old Iron.
Nina Simone. And with the Timside Four, your repertoire ranged from songs like that to British traditional material.
Yeah, there were one or two in there. Well, they were fairly heady days. People had wide-ranging repertoires. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting time. I mean, we used to have a session every week at the Troubadour on the Tuesday, which wasn't a late-night session, and we had a session at a pub called the King and Queen on a Friday. That was just around the back of Goodge Street, near the Middlesex Hospital. And all sorts of people used to come along, and I can remember one day a particular bloke coming along whose face I recognised off the front of a record sleeve. It was a Folkways record of songs that had been written in protest against the stationing of American nuclear submarines at Holy Loch, and it was a chap called Nigel Denver. And he sang around for a long time. He eventually moved to Lincoln, and I was up doing a club he was running in Lincoln when we'd finished the club. Dave Swarbrick and I were working there, and we sat down in his house, and he said, "Listen to this, Sunshine," and he played me this tape of this man singing, and it was a fellow called Joseph Taylor, and he had a couple of tracks. He had, one of them was Creeping Jane, and the other one was Died for Love, and this was a moment.
I wish my baby it was born, lying smiling on his father's knee, and I was dead and in my grave and green grass growing all over me. I wish but it's all in vain. I wish I was a maid again, but a maid again that never can be, since that the young farmer said to in me. Dig me my grave long, wide and deep, put a marble stone at my head and feet, but a turtle white dove put over a boat, but to let the world know that I died for love.
And these must have been recorded right at the beginning of the century.
1908.
And this was the Percy Grainger recording.
The Percy Grainger recordings, yes. He went up to Lincolnshire in 1908, and he recorded people like Joseph Taylor and others. I mean, this was a name I'd heard. Joseph Taylor was a name I'd heard, and it was somewhere so far in the past that I never thought I'd actually get to hear. I actually didn't think about hearing them. Mm-hmm. You know, if you see a list of names in Cecil Sharp's notebook, you don't actually think about, or I didn't think about the way they sounded. To me, they were just a row of notes. Do you know what I mean? And suddenly to hear this was, I can truthfully say it was a real blast from the past. And it really did sit me up. I sat rigid, upright, listening to this man. And ever since then, I've had a fascination with the way the way names sounded. If I can actually get to see what they look like, it's great. And to see a picture of Louisa Hooper in Cecil Sharp House is great. But when I actually went down into the archives and found a recording of Louisa Hooper made in about 1940 by Maud Carpellies, I can't tell you what that did. This was when Cecil Sharp went out in Hambridge in 1903. The person they all talk about in meeting is John England. Well, John England gave him half a dozen songs, give or take. But Louisa Hooper and Lucy White, her sister, and their other sister, Lizzie Welch, gave him dozens of songs, all around about the same time, late August, beginning of September 1903. And there in 1940, she recorded, and then in 1960, Frozen to Death, I'm sitting there listening to a recording of this woman, and it was the most thrilling experience.
Georgie, she had a son, see, and he sold the King's Deers and went and sold him in Bohenny. Mm-hmm. And then he was hanged, see, in a golden chain. Yeah. That's hanging, too. My Georgie shall be hanged in a golden chain, and that's a chain of many. He stole 16 of the King's royal deers, and he stole them in Bohenny. He stole 16 of the King's royal deers, and he stole them in Bohenny. Oh, he never stole no ducks nor no geese, nor he never murdered any. He's told 16 of the king's royal deer, and he sold them in Bohemie. Only Georgie shall be hanged in a golden chain, and that's a chain of many. He's told 16 of the king's royal deer, and he sold them in Bohemie. It's a pretty song. Yeah.
An eerie feeling going right that way back, isn't it?
It's the sort of thing that I absolutely love. I have a friend who lives in Seattle who is called Hank Bradley. And Hank is, he talks about listening to recordings like that as like looking down a telescope the wrong way. And you can just see something at the end, and the excitement is actually trying to pick out exactly what it is.
Well, Martin, it gives some indication of your interest in English traditional music and where that comes from. What about your guitar style?
Well, the guitar players I admire, I'm not actually particularly crazy about guitar players as a general rule. Most of my favourite instrumentalists play other instruments. They play things like fiddles and pipes and whistles and flutes and, well, anything really. But I think that most of my early life has, I was affected by directness. Any examples I took, any role models, if you like, were people who spoke directly with the voice and the guitar. When you hear Libba Cotton singing Freight Train, she's tracing what she's singing on the guitar, or she's tracing what she's playing with her voice, whichever way you want to look at it. With Big Bill Broomsey, you've got a similar kind of directness, but what he's doing there is he's doing a question and answer thing. He sings a line, then plays a line, and sings a line and plays a line. With people like Mance Lipscomb, what you get is what he's doing is actually following exactly what he's exactly what he's singing with his guitar while he's singing. But I like that sort of directness, and anything I've achieved is actually, I think, thanks to people like Broomsey and Mance on the guitar, is due to people like Libba Cotton, Mance Lipscomb, and Big Bill Broomsey, and people like that who speak directly.
Mance Lipscomb. Martin, I'm interested in what you're saying about directness. Would you like to develop that?
I don't know if I can. There's a lot of people around singing and playing who introduce a lot of artifice into singing and playing, and I think I've probably done my fair share of that, or maybe even more than my fair share of that. But I think all the people I loved, even through that, were all people who were that direct. And when I chose to sit down and listen to them and absorb the lessons was when things began to make sense for me properly on stage and on record. I think it's possible to sing, well, thanks to Tony Savage in Leicester, I discovered that it was perfectly possible for a person to be surrounded by a huge orchestra and still speak so directly that it can shake you right to your roots. And the very first time he played me Maria Callas, I don't think I recovered for about 2 hours.
Maria Callas. Coming towards the end of the programme, Martin, I wonder if there are any other musical influences on your life.
I think in all the time I've been involved with this music, there is one person who stands out as being quite extraordinary, and an influence in a very indirect way. He would come and stand at your shoulder and maybe offer you a piece of music or a song. If you did something nice or something he thought was good, he would ring you up or write you a little letter, and that's Bert Lloyd. He was a quite extraordinary man. It was a sad day when he died. He was a very special, extraordinary man.
Let's have one final example, musical example. Martin, what shall we finish?
Well, a couple of years ago, I was involved in a recording with Ashley Hutchings when he did his, I always call it his Cecil Sharp on a Bike record. An hour with Ashley Hutchings and Cecil Sharp, or the other way around. And one of the things he gave me to listen to was a little fragment of the banks of the Nile, and I sprinted off to Cecil Sharp House, and I got the rest of it courtesy of Malcolm Taylor. And I don't know who this. I don't think anybody knows. I don't think it's been worked out who this man singing on this recording is.
This is
another cylinder recording, which presumably makes it about 1908 to 1910. It's either recorded by Percy Grainger, or Cecil Sharp, possibly Vaughan Williams or Lucy Broadwood, but nobody knows.
Drums are beating, no longer can I stay. I hear the bugle sounding, my love, I must away. How many's a long mile to go fight those black and heathens on the banks of the Nile?
Hark, I hear the drums are beating, no longer can I stay. I hear the bugle sounding, my love, I must away. We are called on for orders, and it's many's a long mile to go fight with all those legions on the banks of the Nile. Oh, Willie, dearest Willie, don't leave me here to mourn. You'll make me curse and rue the day that ever I was born. For the parting of my own true love is a parting of my life. Stay at home, dear William, I will be your wife. I will cut off those yellow locks, and I'll go along with you. I'll dress myself in velveteen and go and see Egypt too. I'll fight and bear your banner while kind fortune on me smile, and we'll comfort one another on the banks of the Nile. Oh, Nancy, dearest Nancy, with me you cannot go. For our colonel has give orders, no women there can go. You will forget your own true love when you are on the shore, and you'll think of things that please your mind, and new loves will please you more. Cursed be those cruel bloody wars that took my love from me, and cursed be the order that put his boat to sea. I fear the burning sun will shine his beauty to destroy, and his blood will seep in the grass that's deep on the banks of the Nile.
Martin Carthy, who tonight has been talking about his musical influences. My name's Jim Lloyd, producer Geoffrey HEWITT. Good night.
Martin Carthy and his arrangement of La Cardeuse. Well, next week, Jim Lloyd returns at the same time with another unusual edition of Folk on 2, this time featuring the women of the Bulgarian State Radio and Television Choir in concert from the Royal Festival Hall in London. That's Folk on 2, 7 o'clock next Wednesday evening.